Story 1. The Midnight Visitor. In 2010, I attended a summer camp called Camp Pinewood. My parents had signed me up without asking, but luckily my best friend Ryan was coming too. Having him there made it bearable, or so I thought at first. Camp Pinewood was straight out of a classic summer camp horror movie. 2 big cabins for boys and girls, a central lodge with a dining hall and activity center, and smaller buildings scattered around the campgrounds. Ryan and I were inseparable, even staying up late playing our Nintendo DS's under the covers after everyone else was asleep. One night, well past 2 a.m., we were still battling it out in Mario Kart when the cabin door creaked open. We froze. Panicked, we shoved our DS's under our pillows and pretended to be asleep. Footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, stopping at Ryan's bed first, then slowly approaching mine. I felt someone standing over me, breathing softly down my neck. My heart pounded, but I didn't dare move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps retreated, and the door closed again. I shot up and whispered to Ryan. That was terrifying. Someone was breathing on me. We tried to laugh it off and resume playing, but a few minutes later, my phone buzzed. I had a text message from an unknown number that read, "Why are you two still awake?" Every camper with a phone was given a list of counselor numbers in case of emergencies, but that number didn't match any of them. I texted back, "Who is this?" but got no response. I showed Ryan, who didn't have a phone, and his face turned pale. A few minutes later, we heard the back door of the cabin open. We threw our DS's under the pillows again and waited in silence. No footsteps this time, just the door creaking open and staying that way. My phone buzzed once more. The text read, "It's Counselor Greg. Come outside. I need to talk to you at the back door." Ryan whispered, "That's way too suspicious." I got up and tiptoed toward the back door, my heart thudding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and in the faint moonlight I noticed a figure hiding in a recessed corner near the door. As I stepped closer, I saw him, a man in tattered clothes with wild eyes, crouching like a predator. He wasn't a counselor. He was a stranger. I bolted back to my bed, screaming for help. The cabin exploded with panic as kids woke up. A counselor burst through the front door, and I told him everything. He and several others searched the campgrounds, but the man was gone, vanished into the woods. To this day, I still wonder how that man got my number, and how he knew exactly who I was. Story 2. The Woman in the Window. It was the summer of 2008, and I had just turned 13. My parents sent me to a teenage summer camp for the first time, a camp that catered to kids aged 13 to 16. The camp was old, with a strange history. Whispers of eerie occurrences passed through campfire stories like ghostly echoes. The most well-known tale involved a cafeteria worker named Miss Graham, who had allegedly died mysteriously on the campgrounds. No one knew the full story, but it was enough to spook anyone willing to listen. One particular night, I found myself wide awake while everyone else in my cabin was sound asleep. The thin, uncomfortable cot beneath me made it nearly impossible to rest. The light from a full moon poured into the room, illuminating everything in a soft, ghostly glow. I tossed and turned, silently cursing my inability to sleep. Frustrated, I sat up and rubbed my eyes. As my vision adjusted, I noticed something strange. The window across from me was partially blocked. My heart skipped a beat when I realized what it was. A face. A woman's face, partially obscured by a red cap, was staring right at me. Her eyes locked onto mine, cold and unblinking. A jolt of fear shot through my body. I froze, unsure if I was imagining it or if it was real. My instincts kicked in, and I threw myself down onto the cot, pulling the blanket over my head like a frightened child. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for what felt like hours before mustering the courage to peek out from under the blanket. The face was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that sense of safety was fleeting. Something still felt wrong. The room seemed darker, colder. My eyes drifted to the window above my bed. That's when I saw her again, this time much closer. She was standing just outside the window, her face mere inches from mine. Her eyes were dark, almost empty, but filled with an unsettling intensity. Her breath fogged up the glass as she stared down at me. Paralyzed with fear, I threw the blanket back over my head. My mind raced with thoughts. Who was this woman? What did she want? I clenched my eyes shut, praying for sleep to take me, but I was too terrified to relax. I waited and waited, until finally, exhaustion must have won and I drifted off. The next morning, I rushed to tell one of the camp supervisors what had happened. I described the woman in detail, the red cap, her unsettling gaze, the way she had stared at me through the window. The supervisor's face paled. He exchanged a knowing look with two other staff members who seemed equally disturbed. "That sounds like Miss Graham," one of the women said softly. "She always wore a red cap." A chill ran down my spine. Miss Graham, the same woman who had supposedly died on the campgrounds. I didn't know if what I saw that night was a living person, a hallucination, or something far worse. All I knew was that her face, with its cold, unblinking eyes, haunted my dreams for months afterward. Story 3. The Abandoned Bunkhouse. When I was 9 years old, my parents sent me to a sleepaway camp in Pennsylvania. I was shy and reserved, the kind of kid who preferred playing video games at home rather than mingling with strangers. On the first day, I felt completely out of place until a boy named Danny befriended me. He was outgoing and confident, the kind of kid who could charm anyone with a quick smile. I looked up to him instantly. During the camp orientation, Danny and I noticed an old, run-down bunkhouse at the edge of the property. The wooden walls were warped and faded, the windows boarded up, and the surrounding grass was overgrown. We asked one of the counselors about it, but all he said was that it hadn't been used in years. The mystery of the abandoned bunkhouse lingered in our minds for days. On the final night of camp, Danny leaned over and whispered to me, "Let's go check out the abandoned bunkhouse." I hesitated at first, but Danny's excitement was contagious. I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I agreed. We waited until the camp was silent, sneaking out of our cabin under the cover of darkness. The moon provided just enough light to guide our way as we made our way toward the old bunkhouse. The air was cold and still, and every sound seemed amplified in the quiet of the night. When we reached the building, we saw that the front door was boarded up, but one of the side windows was broken and partially open. Danny grinned and climbed through first, urging me to follow. The inside of the bunkhouse smelled of mildew and rot. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and the air was thick with dust. We moved cautiously, using our hands to guide us through the darkness. The room was filled with old bunk beds, their mattresses torn and stained with age. Danny laughed as he stumbled into one, but the sound quickly faded as we heard something else, the soft creak of a mattress. "Stop messing around," I whispered, assuming Danny was bouncing on one of the beds, but his voice came from across the room. "I'm not doing anything," he said, his tone suddenly serious. We stood frozen, listening as the sound of creaking continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from one of the bunk beds at the far end of the room. My pulse quickened as the creaking grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. A heavy thud echoed through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving toward us. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Danny grabbed my arm, his grip tight with fear. "We need to go, now," he whispered. We turned and ran for the window, scrambling to climb out as fast as we could. Danny made it out first, but as I pulled myself through, I felt something grab my ankle, cold, clammy fingers wrapping around me, trying to pull me back inside. I kicked frantically, breaking free and tumbling onto the grass. Danny grabbed my hand and we sprinted back to our cabin, slamming the door behind us and locking it tight. We sat there in silence, our hearts racing, too scared to speak. The next morning, we considered telling one of the counselors, but fear of getting in trouble kept us quiet. Looking back, I wish we had said something. I'll never forget the feeling of those hands on my ankle, or the sound of those footsteps in the dark.